On the morning of June 6, 1944, Lieutenant Jean Dubois stood at the window of his concrete bunker, his gaze fixed on the foggy horizon. The first rays of light began to illuminate the empty beach in front of him, casting long shadows over the sand. The air was still, almost eerily silent, with only the distant sound of the waves lapping at the shore. Dubois slowly cleaned the barrel of his rifle, his movements deliberate and steady, as though the task itself held some greater significance. His focus was absolute, and in that moment, cleaning his weapon was the only thing that mattered. In his pocket, tucked away carefully, was a letter from his mother. She had written to him just days earlier, her words filled with love and concern, urging him to stay safe and return home. She prayed for his safety, she said, and she spoke of the hope that the war would soon end. Dubois kept the letter close, feeling its weight against his chest as he absent-mindedly touched the paper. The letter, though a simple connection to his life before the war, felt like a lifeline, a reminder of who he was and what he was fighting for. He glanced again at the horizon, his mind filled with a sense of calm. It was a strange quiet, but to him, it was reassuring. The beach stretched out in front of him, empty and tranquil, just as it had been every morning since he had arrived here months ago. He had become accustomed to the routine, the patrols, the drills, the long hours of waiting. Nothing had changed. Nothing had needed to change. He believed in the strength of the French defenses. General Liebel had assured them the line was impenetrable. The bunkers, the reinforced walls, the barbed wire, everything had been built to withstand the coming onslaught. The German army had made sure of that. Dubois had heard the reports, had witnessed the preparations. Allied forces were gathering somewhere across the English Channel, but they would never make it through the Atlantic Wall. His confidence in the defenses was unshakable. They were ready. He was ready. In his mind, he saw the Allied forces attempting to land on the beaches. They would be greeted by the relentless fire of French gunners, the sound of machine guns and artillery that would turn the tide in their favor. No one could get past the Atlantic Wall. Not the Americans, not the British. Dubois had heard the rumors of an impending invasion, of the Allied forces planning to storm the beaches of Normandy. But in his heart, he was sure they would fail. It would be another victory for the Germans. Another day for him and his comrades to hold the line. As he stood there, looking out at the empty beach, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The calm before the storm, he thought. He would stand his ground and fight. The beach, the bunkers, the walls. They were all that stood between France and the invading forces, and he would protect it, just as the men before him had done. His mind wandered to the days before the war, to the life he had left behind. His mother's letter reminded him of his past, of the world he once knew. But that world felt so far away now, replaced by the harsh reality of war. He shook the thought away, focusing once again on the horizon. This was his duty now. His life was here, on this beach, defending his homeland from the advancing enemy. With a final glance at the sky, Dubois felt a sense of resolve. He wasn't afraid. How could he be? The French defenses had been built to withstand anything. He had faith in his comrades, in the strength of their position. The beach would hold. No enemy could break through. His thoughts drifted to what the future might hold. They would win. They had to. The day stretched before him like any other. Routine, predictable. And yet, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. Something was coming. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the tension in the air was palpable. Today would be different, he knew. The calm on the beach wouldn't last forever. Something big was about to happen, and whatever it was, he would be ready. The defensive line along the Normandy coast was a monumental display of military engineering, a fortress meant to repel any and all attacks. Towering concrete walls rose above the beach, reinforced with massive machine gun nests, artillery positions, and strategically placed minefields that stretched across the sands. The sheer scale of the fortifications created an impression of impenetrability, a wall that would hold against any force that dared approach. For Lieutenant Jean Dubois and his unit, guarding one of the most critical sections of the front, this line was not just a physical barrier, but a symbol of their resolve. For weeks, they had been preparing for this moment, engaged in the standard routine of training drills and patrols. Dubois and his comrades practiced the same movements, honed their skills with monotonous precision, and fortified their position, all the while confident in the strength of their defenses. The constant reassurance from higher command only solidified their belief. The enemy stood no chance. "We are ready. We will not give the enemy a single chance," Dubois thought, standing on his post, surveying the horizon. He listened to the senior officers' tales of the unassailable positions, the impeccable construction of the Atlantic Wall, and how their defenses were beyond reproach. Everything had been calculated, every angle covered, and the machinery of war was set in place. As the days passed, there was a growing sense of certainty among the men, particularly in the face of what seemed like routine reports. While there were whispers about the possibility of an invasion, Dubois found little reason to worry. The signs pointed to a different narrative. In the weeks leading up to the D-Day landings, the intelligence received was a mixture of vague information and unconfirmed rumors. The reports mentioned the potential of an Allied landing along the coast of Normandy, but these were always accompanied by a grain of doubt. Senior officers were quick to dismiss them, attributing the chatter to propaganda or misinformation designed to disrupt the German forces' confidence. The prevailing sentiment in the officer corps was that an invasion was unlikely. The defenses had been built to withstand it. They had prepared for any possible attack. The belief in their security was almost palpable. They had positioned their forces, set up their guns, and scattered mines across the sand. What more could they need? Though the high command was dismissive, Dubois and his men maintained their vigilance, still carrying out their duties with the same rigor as always. They could feel the weight of their responsibility, knowing that the fate of this stretch of coastline was in their hands. Each day they patrolled the beaches, keeping a keen eye out for any signs of the enemy. But the calm routine and the lack of significant activity on the horizon gave them little reason to believe that an attack was imminent. Despite the apparent stillness, something in the air had shifted. Dubois, who had spent countless hours standing guard over the desolate beach, began to notice subtle signs of unease creeping into the ranks. Whispers of a larger-scale operation filtered through the men, though these murmurs were quickly hushed by the confidence instilled by their commanders. The daily routines continued, almost like clockwork, and yet there was a faint undercurrent of something not quite right. Dubois could sense that the atmosphere was charged with a quiet tension that had yet to surface. For a time, he tried to ignore it, clinging to the assurance that had been drilled into him. The preparations for battle had been so thorough, and the walls they had built, literally and figuratively, were so robust that he felt an unshakable confidence in the system they had put in place. The orders were simple: stand firm, hold the line, and fight to the last man if need be. They would not allow the Allies to breach the coast. With each passing day, he became more certain that the enemy would find nothing but failure in their attempts. However, the Germans' complacency, their belief that they had everything under control, would prove to be their fatal flaw. The reports, dismissed as exaggerations, began to accumulate. The Allies were not simply amassing forces. They were meticulously preparing for one of the largest and most complex military operations ever conceived. The German commanders, lulled by their own overconfidence, failed to understand the scale of the threat. The Allies had learned from the mistakes of past engagements, and now they were ready to strike when the time was right. As Dubois continued to watch the horizon, the moment of reckoning was silently approaching. All the preparations and expectations that had defined the months leading up to this moment were about to collide with the harsh reality of war. What Dubois had believed to be an invincible position, fortified and unyielding, would soon be put to the ultimate test. The moment when the attack would come was now just a breath away, and no amount of preparation, no matter how thorough, could shield them from what was about to unfold. The morning of June 6, 1944, dawned with an eerie stillness hanging in the air. Lieutenant Jean Dubois woke, sensing something different, something unsettling. He had always been attuned to the rhythm of war, to the usual sounds of his men moving and the distant hum of machinery. But today, there was a strange, almost unnatural quiet. The normal buzz of activity seemed absent. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and reached for the radio. The static buzzed before the familiar voice of the announcer broke through, offering the first reports of the day. Listening intently, Dubois quickly realized that the invasion had not yet begun. The weather had turned, and the morning fog obscured everything in sight. His thoughts, usually sharp and clear, were now clouded with a sense of doubt. He had expected an attack at any moment, but the quiet made him question whether it was just the weather playing tricks on him or something else. Still, he pushed aside the growing unease. There was no reason to believe that the Allies could break through. Not today, not here. As the hours passed, the morning fog thickened, wrapping the beach in a heavy veil that blocked out the sun and made it nearly impossible to see past a few yards. The cold mist seemed to hang on the edge of the world, preventing any sense of clarity. Dubois stood by the window, watching the pale outline of the beach, and tried to shake the tension building within him. The weather, so unlike anything he'd prepared for, was unsettling in its own right. The wind began to pick up, and the waves grew more violent, crashing against the shore with an intensity that seemed to mirror the growing disquiet within him. Meanwhile, the higher command seemed oblivious to the potential danger. The radio reports trickled in, and there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere within the German military ranks. Confidence began to settle back in. The expected attack was being downplayed, as if the weather itself had conspired to delay the inevitable. As hours passed without any sign of action, the commanders began to relax. Many had assumed that if anything was going to happen, it would have been yesterday or the day before. But now it seemed that all the preparation and vigilance were for nothing. No one expected anything more than a false alarm. The German officers allowed themselves to believe that the Allies were not prepared, that they would not risk an invasion under such unpredictable conditions. And yet, with every passing minute, the sound of distant activity increased, a faint but unmistakable rumble that began to grow stronger. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a low hum in the distance, but it became clear that something was changing. The signals of approaching danger began to grow louder, more urgent. Dubois, sensing a shift, went to check on his men, moving quickly from one post to the next, his mind racing as the pressure to secure the perimeter mounted. The first alarm was raised when one of the sentries spotted unusual movements in the distance. He had been watching the horizon for hours, but now, through the thick fog, he saw the silhouette of something large, something far too vast for his mind to comprehend. Dubois heard the shouted warning and quickly ran to the edge of the cliff. The air was thick with anticipation as he scanned the horizon, his eyes straining against the murkiness of the weather. And then he saw it, something that would forever change his understanding of warfare. The sea, once calm and quiet, was now teeming with ships. It wasn't just a handful or even a few dozen, there were thousands. Thousands of vessels of every size, ranging from enormous warships to smaller landing craft, all moving steadily towards the shore. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time, the reality of the situation hit him with full force. This wasn't a limited operation. This was an invasion of monumental proportions. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. It was impossible, unimaginable. He had never been prepared for this. The enormity of the situation brought an icy grip to his chest. Every doubt, every moment of complacency he had felt in the past weeks was now shattered. His understanding of the battlefield, of the fortified defenses they had so carefully constructed, crumbled under the weight of this overwhelming sight. The forces that were approaching were beyond anything he had ever anticipated. The preparations they had made seemed insignificant in comparison to what was coming. As the boats continued to approach, Dubois felt a surge of fear mixed with disbelief. His heart raced as he thought of the men under his command, of the resources at his disposal, and how inadequate they all seemed in the face of this mighty force. He had always believed that their line was unbreakable, that the Atlantic wall would hold. But now, watching the mass of ships slowly but surely bearing down on them, he knew that everything was about to change. The tide of war had shifted. The first artillery fire began just minutes later, shattering the quiet that had lingered. The sound of explosions reverberated through the air as the shoreline erupted in chaos. The German defenders, caught off guard and unprepared for the scale of the assault, scrambled to respond. Dubois and his men rushed to their positions, desperately trying to prepare for the onslaught, but the realization had already set in. The battle they had been preparing for had begun, and there was no turning back. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the beach, Lieutenant Jean Dubois stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the cold sand. His breath hung in the air as he looked out across the shore, witnessing something he could never have prepared for. The vast expanse of the beach, once seemingly endless and tranquil, was now filled with the chaotic rush of Allied forces. Massive ships, each larger than anything he had imagined, began to unload their human cargo, a sea of soldiers disembarking from landing crafts that surged toward the shore with purpose and precision. It was an unstoppable force, coming at them from every direction. The German soldiers, stationed along the coast, were the first to open fire, sending a hail of bullets and artillery shells toward the advancing enemy. But the fire seemed to be swallowed by the sound of explosions and the overwhelming surge of men and equipment storming the beaches. The enemy was not just coming. They were engulfing the landscape with a sheer volume of force that no one could have prepared for. The air was thick with the screams of men, the thunderous roar of gunfire, and the sound of artillery shells tearing through the air. The confusion and chaos that followed were beyond anything Dubois had imagined. It was at that moment, standing on the sands of Normandy, that Dubois felt the crushing weight of realization. His certainty, the steadfast belief that their defenses were impenetrable, began to fade away. Despite the countless hours of preparation, despite every word spoken by General Liebel that promised victory, the war was no longer in their hands. It was slipping through their fingers. The concrete bunkers, the machine gun nests, and the artillery emplacements that had once seemed invincible now appeared as fragile as paper. The beach, once a site of relative safety and defense, was now a scene of utter devastation. The sand was stained with blood, the air filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder and smoke. Soldiers, some of them his own men, lay lifeless or wounded across the beach, their bodies scattered in the wake of the invasion. The German line, which had been considered unbreachable just hours before, was now crumbling. What had seemed like an impenetrable defense was being torn apart under the relentless pressure of the enemy's assault. The once proud fortifications that had stood as symbols of German strength were now reduced to rubble. The sounds of battle, the screams of the wounded, and the cries of the dying filled the air. Dubois, standing at the edge of it all, could do nothing but watch in horror as the beach became a graveyard of broken promises and shattered dreams. The tide of war was no longer in their favor. In the midst of the chaos, Dubois felt a deep sense of helplessness. He could hear the frantic shouts of his men, trying to rally and hold their positions, but their voices seemed distant, as though they were coming from another world entirely. His mind raced, but the clarity that had once been his guide was now clouded by confusion. The strategies, the tactics, the defensive positions that had once seemed so foolproof, none of them mattered now. The enemy was here, in full force, and there was nothing that could stop them. The feeling of defeat was overwhelming. It wasn't just the loss of men, equipment, or positions. It was the collapse of everything he had believed in. The promise of victory, the unwavering belief in their superiority, was shattered. The war was no longer about strategy or tactics. It was about survival. And even that, Dubois realized, was slipping away. His grip on reality seemed to slip, and the world around him, the sand, the blood, the destruction, became surreal, as though he were watching a nightmare unfold in real time. The battlefield had become something unrecognizable, something far beyond the scope of his comprehension. It was a chaos that no soldier, no matter how seasoned, could ever be ready for. The impossible had happened, and there was nothing left but to endure the relentless storm that had come ashore. By the evening, as the battle gradually subsided, Lieutenant Jean Dubois sat in his shelter, his face caked with dirt and his uniform stained with the blood of his comrades. Around him lay the bodies of fallen soldiers, the remnants of destroyed fortifications, and the wreckage of shattered equipment. The once pristine beach, the site of what he had believed would be a decisive victory, was now a graveyard. He could scarcely believe that only a few hours earlier he had been so sure of their success. He had stood on the beach with an unwavering belief that the fortifications would hold, that their defense was impenetrable. Now he was surrounded by the crushing reality of defeat. The enemy, whose strength and strategy had been underestimated, had overrun the beach with an overwhelming force. The industrial might of the Allies, their resources, and their tactical superiority had proven far too much for even the most fortified defense. The fortifications, the artillery, the machine gun nests, all of it had been rendered futile in the face of an unstoppable invasion. As the sounds of gunfire grew quieter and the horizon began to show signs of the battle's end, Dubois was left to reflect on the magnitude of what had transpired. The immense scale of the enemy's attack had shattered all his previous assumptions about warfare. What he had once seen as a battle of strength, of fortifications and firepower, now seemed insignificant compared to the sheer force and determination of the Allied forces. The realization was almost unbearable. Their defenses had been a mere illusion against a power they had not anticipated. The day, which had begun with a sense of certainty and purpose, had ended in complete destruction. The beach, once a symbol of German strength, now stood as a testament to the overwhelming power of the Allies. Dubois could no longer hold on to the belief that victory was solely a product of strength and preparation. The war was not just about building fortifications or holding a position. It was about the ability to adapt, to respond to the unexpected, and to confront challenges that could not be foreseen. As the last of the fighting faded and the sun began to set on the wreckage, Dubois sat in stunned silence. He felt the weight of the day's events pressing on him, the realization that his understanding of war had been irrevocably changed. What he had once thought to be the path to victory, fortifications, strategy, unwavering confidence, had been rendered obsolete by the sheer scale and power of the enemy's assault. The defeat was not just physical, but psychological, as it forced him to confront the harsh truth. Victory was no longer a certainty, and the ability to adapt had become the true measure of survival. The battle had left its scars, not just on the land but on Dubois himself. His world had been shattered in the span of a few hours, and as he sat amidst the destruction, he understood that this was more than just a military defeat. It was a personal reckoning. The lesson was painful, but undeniable. In war, strength alone is not enough. Only those who can adapt, who can meet the unforeseen with resilience and creativity, will survive. And as Dubois looked out at the horizon, he knew that this lesson would shape the rest of his life, long after the war had ended.